And so who is Michael? Michael is a writer. He was English first, and he moved to LA, and now he's living in LA forever. And he has wrote a lot of books. He has collaborated with many magazines, and in architecture and design, and also he has been specialist in movie and cinema, American cinema, when he took part of some exhibition about cinema, American cinema. So, and we will know now, thanks to Michael, why do you speak about Sublime? What is it for you and what it is in general? Thank you very much.
So, when Odile asked me if I would be interested in doing a lecture while I was for a few days in Paris, I was very happy to oblige, and I'm very flattered to have such a large turnout. It's not something I do regularly. Most of the time I spend writing books or articles. And so you'll forgive me if this is a rather different kind of lecture than the ones you usually get. I'm curious, how many of you love classical music, go to concerts, opera houses? Anybody?
Can you raise that hand?
Hands up so I can see.
Okay.
Oh, good, some. So, even if it isn't your kind of music, even if you prefer something else, and everybody has different tastes in music, I think you'll find here material that's relevant to your interest in architecture. So I'd like to give you a preview of a book I'm writing jointly with music critic Thomas Small on music venues that delight the eyes and the ears. It traces the evolution of two distinct but related typologies, opera houses and concert halls. Architecture and music are universal languages, and they can be tightly interwoven, each intensifying what the other has to offer. Opera has its roots in masks, staged spectacles, comprising music, dance, special effects, mounted in Renaissance courts to celebrate a dynastic marriage or a state visit. Operas as we know them today, a story told in recitatives, arias, and choruses, were first composed in Florence around 1600, and the earliest surviving masterpiece is Orfeo, composed by Monteverdi around 1607 for the court in Mantua. Italian traveling companies carried opera all over Europe, and it rapidly became a popular entertainment for all classes. Commercial theaters proliferated. There were 13 in Venice by 1700. It was like the cinema from a slightly earlier period in this century. Well, in Paris, I know cinema survives and flourishes, so it's very much like cinema today. Rulers and noble families built intimate opera houses in their palaces, and this is one of the earliest and most beautiful. The Cuvier's Theatre, built in the residence of the electors of Bavaria in Munich. As you can see, it's a horseshoe. This is looking from the stage, and there are tiers of boxes, and at the very center at the back, the royal box where the elector sat when he chose to come. And this was essentially by invitation. It was very much an exclusive event. And it's one of the few that has survived intact and is still being used for regular concerts, along with other opera houses and concert halls in Munich. The horseshoe, it's interesting how a form develops sometimes quite quickly and then takes root. The horseshoe brings people relatively close to the stage as against a bank of seating in a rectilinear space stretching back. It also puts the people in the boxes on show. They become part of the spectacle. So the humbler people sitting in the parterre can look up and admire their rulers or betters or whoever flaunting their jewelry and the latest, their décolletage. And it became a kind of spectacle that people, a certain class of people, went to regularly simply to be there. It was almost like a salon that gathered people together. This is a much larger theater that began as a royal theater, but is now very much a popular theater, the Teatro San Carlo in Naples. It's on a much larger scale. I think it has something like 1,500 seats against the 400 or 500 of the Cuvier's theater. And like most theaters of this period, it burnt down. The average life, apparently, of a theater at that time is about 18 years, because everything that you see, all the light bulbs, all the illumination was candles. Well, you can imagine how easy it was in a wood theater covered with draperies to create a fire. And this happened over and over and over again. And this theater, which is probably one of the most beautiful theaters in Europe, was rebuilt after a fire in 1816. And it was enlarged. They took the opportunity to enlarge it because at that time Naples was one of the musical capitals of Europe, and there were a lot of musicians. People were passionate about music, so they needed more space. And it's a hierarchy. You've got the parterre, the boxes, the lower end, but then you've got at the top, and by the way, this photograph is taken from the royal box, so the gold curtains that you can see here are essentially framing the view of the King of Naples, as he then was, restored after the Napoleonic Wars. And the whole composition of this is designed for his benefit. In other words, he gets the prime view and everybody sees it. But for almost no money, you could stand in the upper gallery. And then if you didn't like what was going on in stage, you had a sack of rotten tomatoes, which you hurled with great accuracy at the players who had displeased you. And Beniamo Gigli, who was a fantastic tenor earlier in this century, in the last century, was booed off the stage, something that he'd never experienced before, and he vowed he would never come back to Naples. The Grand Theatre in Bordeaux was commissioned by the provincial governor, the Duc de Richelieu, in the 1770s to replace a theatre destroyed by fire. And the architect Victor Louis created this very impressive civic monument. Before, theatres had either been embedded in the royal palace, like the Cuvier's theatre, or they were just part of the street. They didn't announce themselves, it was just another facade. It could have been a shop or a workshop. But this one clearly stands out. This is the birth of two things. The Opera House is a civic monument, something that would be immediately visible, a point of focus for all the streets around. And then a orchestrated architectural promenade. You enter, you walk up the steps from the square, you enter a very low-ceilinged lobby, and then you emerge into this extraordinary foyer, top-lit from an oculus, with what appears to be another building, almost a building within a building, which you approach up the staircase. And Charles Garnier, when he was imagining, his design for the Garnier Theatre here in Paris, visited Bordeaux and really got his inspiration from this staircase. When you go inside, you'll see there are no boxes. The boxes were regarded by the French at the time, even before the Revolution, as being breeding grounds for immorality. I mean, who knows what was going on in the box since nobody could really see into it. And also that it imposed a hierarchy, and they abandoned that and created, even though there are bays between the columns, an open balcony, which then became the French style, in contrast to the Italians and Spanish, who still clung to their boxes. And in La Scala, San Carlo, wherever, families would buy a box and decorate it to suit themselves. It became their home away from home. And they would play cards, and they would entertain friends, and dinner would be served in the room in back. And occasionally they might actually look at the stage and pause their conversation to listen to a favorite singer. But it was very much a kind of social rather than artistic for them. The still more revolutionary is the Festspielhaus that Wagner built. Wagner spent much of his life composing and conducting and dreaming of a place where he could present the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art that was his opera, in which music and voices and decor would combine to create a spectacle, a unique spectacle. And he had no money. He relied upon rich patrons to support him. And he had several good offers. You know, the King of Prussia invited him to Berlin, and the King Ludwig invited him to Munich. But he had fallen in love with Bayreuth, a small city, and he picked out a site on a hill just outside the town and built this theater of wood, but painted to resemble marble. And he was inspired by the Greek amphitheaters that, you know, essentially a hemisphere of outdoor seating, which was adapted by the Romans, who then built an elaborate scenic wall here on the left where the stage is, as a backdrop for the actors, and stretched a canopy over the seating in order to protect it from sun or rain. And Wagner picked up on that idea and created a painted canopy. Everything in this theater is a kind of trompe-l'oeil illusion. And he tried to make the atmosphere of the theater as open and democratic as possible. Not only are there no boxes, there are no tiers either. There's just I think 1,000 seats, very hard, very uncomfortable seats. You can't snooze, you have to keep awake. And the floors are the kind of rough wood floors you'd find in a tool shed. There is no pretense, no decor. And because the seating comes in like that, walls extend out from the side, as you can see, to fill the space, but also diffuse the sound, because in an opera house, the genius of the original designers, lacking any of the expertise we now have about acoustics, figured out that if you had a contained space with certain proportions, and the ornament, which was, of course, part of the aesthetic of the time, would break up the sounds. It wouldn't go boom, boom. It would, as it were, spread around and be distributed evenly. A bit like, you know, a shower that, instead of pouring down on you, sets separate streams of water coming down. So, in a way, that's the way the acoustics work. But it's really not a theater, it's a shrine. People go and sit for 4 or 5 hours to hear an opera like Parsifal, and they're aching with pain at the end of it, and it's an ordeal. But, you know, for the true believer, it's worth it. Very much in contrast, done almost 100 years later, is the opera house that Alvar Aalto designed for the city of Essen in 1959. And this was a civic initiative. Essen was an industrial city that relied on coal and steel and had been bombed very heavily during the Second World War, and had never had an opera house, because at that point it was, you know, an industrial city that was all about work and smoke and dirt. And so the civic fathers after the war wanted to, as it were, reinvent the city. They were losing their industry, as everywhere In Europe, the coal and steel industry declined and disappeared, so they needed a new attraction. So they commissioned Aalto to do this theater in a park in his trademark white marble, very about the most different thing you could imagine from a coal mine or steelworks, and organically shaped. It wasn't actually built until 1983. They couldn't get their act together, and they waited after he was dead before they actually built it, and his wife supervised the construction. And it's very much a signature work of Aalto. You have, again, the low entry portico, and then an architectural promenade leading up from a low foyer to a very soaring, light-filled lobby with these wavy balconies that echo the balconies inside. So we go from the horseshoe, which was the traditional opera house, to something that's, in a sense, deconstructed or inflected, where the balcony, instead of doing a horseshoe, does a kind of sinuous wave, giving very different views of the auditorium. And in place of the putti and goddesses and angels and so on of traditional opera houses, he creates a stylized forest of birch trees and paints the whole thing midnight blue. And the seating is blue too. Again, a radical shift from opera houses, which traditionally were always red plush. So this marks a significant departure. As I said, it's around 1959 in the design, realized 30 years later. And it gives you the feeling as you're walking up to the steps to the different levels that you're in the park. It's very much connected with the outdoors rather than being entirely enclosed as most opera houses were. In Turin, the theater waited until 1935 before it was burnt down. It was a court theater, 18th century court theater. And when it came time to rebuild after the war, the city turned to Carlo Mellino, a very sybaritic, eccentric Torinese architect, to design an entirely new auditorium within the outside, within the exterior of the old theater. Because generally when theaters burnt down, it was because the interior, the auditorium, was built of wood, but the exterior was stone. So the stone survived, as it did the bombing in Germany and other countries. And what was needed was not a new structure, but rather a new interior. And Mellino did something quite radical. He created this arc of seating where almost everybody sits, but then a series of 35 boxes ranged in a single row around what is essentially a circular auditorium or hexagonal auditorium that becomes a circle. And ribs from the ceiling come down to separate the boxes. And in place of the traditional chandelier, a la Garnier opera, there is a forest of plexi rods that are backlit. And then you have a striped pattern, rather like my shirt, on the ceiling. So everywhere you look, the eyes are delighted. If you don't like what goes on stage, you can look up or sideways or admire, something else. It's a theater that, like the earlier theaters, like the San Carlo and La Scala, a spectacle in itself, almost independently of what goes on stage. The latest wave of opera houses, and there haven't been so many because most of the opera houses that were built in earlier times still survive, but a few new ones have been built, and this is, I think, the most interesting and extreme. It's the Oslo Opera, designed by Snøhetta, a firm of Norwegian and American students who combined to win the Alexandria Library Commission a few years before this was conceived, and beat out, all the top architects in the world to do it. And as they told me, they were very reluctant to take on a commission in Oslo because in their own backyard, they might be fiercely criticized. It was okay doing it in Egypt because they didn't know anybody in Cairo, but they knew everybody in Oslo, and they were very apprehensive. But their scheme, which was essentially a wedge of white marble, ribbed for traction, that runs up to a flat-ceilinged lobby and auditorium, providing a view over the harbor. The ramp runs down into the water, so it's almost as though it emerges from the water. And then you have this fully glazed lobby that wraps around the rear of the auditorium. And as you can see when you're inside, people are walking up the ramp visible to the people down below in the auditorium. And the back of the theater is concealed by this series of tiers that draw upon the Norwegian shipbuilding tradition and, of course, the use of wood. So there are wood staves that create a kind of stylized forest. And given the terrible climate of Oslo, where it rains or snows for most of the year, it's very welcoming to come in from this rather chilly iceberg that is outside and see the wood, and then step into the auditorium where, again, the wood balustrades are designed to distribute the sound, but they're also warm and inviting. And this raises an interesting subject about designing music venues that has been recently commented on a lot, and that's psychoacoustics. When you're in a room, any room, it could be your own living room, it could be a hall of residence, whatever, if you feel comfortable, if the surfaces are warm and inviting, the colors, the textures, the material, you feel better. And you feel more intensely whatever it is that's going on in that room, be it a theater, a concert hall, art gallery. And architects have increasingly begun to realize that. Aalto, who was Finnish, had a rather chilly approach to design. He was very fond of white marble, and he used it inside and outside the Finlandia Hall in Helsinki. And not only is it a rather hard, rather uninviting, chilly surface, which of course amplifies the chilliness of the outdoors, but it's also very bad acoustically. Wood isn't necessarily the best acoustic surface, but an overlay of wood on a hard concrete surface gives a tactile feeling for the spectators and a hard resonant surface from which the sound can bounce off in different directions. In Athens, Renzo Piano may have derived inspiration from this vision, which occurs every night in Athens, of the Parthenon floodlit atop the Acropolis, and it's the great central point of focus for Athens. So he was commissioned by the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, big shipbuilding firm that supports the arts, to design a new opera house and public library on a site 4 kilometers south of the center of the city. And he decided to create this stylized temple atop the opera house, which is on the left, with a library on the right and an administrative building in back of a plaza linking the two. And of course, in Athens, one has the opposite issue from Norway. It's sunny most of the year. it is fiercely hot. So any glazing has to be shaded, and the canopy extends in such a way that it shades the glass, and when the sun is high, and it's topped with photovoltaic panels to generate energy. The library brings a buzz of activity all day long. Concert halls by themselves don't generate much activity except when they're in use. Having a library next door immediately encourages school groups and, residents and others to use the space, to wander into the lobby, to climb to the roof for the view over a park and out to Athens and out to the Acropolis. And there's a canal that links which has fountains in it, and the canal links the site to the sea, which is just a short distance away. So both Oslo and Athens are social generators, and increasingly this is the underlying theme of building any civic venue, that it shouldn't be a closed box, but rather an inviting, open space in which the public can come and use the space in a variety of ways, whether it's a restaurant or sitting with a laptop and using it as a place for study, or library, and gives it a kind of 24/7 value. Concert halls, this is the interior of the Athens Opera House. And it's a fairly conventional layout, surprisingly in a way for piano. But you'll notice that the ceiling doesn't have the usual painted or decorated thing. Rather, it's like a Lucio Fontana canvas that's been slashed through. It has this gash in it, which again kind of creates a sense of energy and vibrancy in the interior. Concert halls are a different animal, but a related species. The dates I'm giving is not, of course, the entire history of concert halls. It's rather the first one that I'm going to show, done 50 years before the first opera house that I showed. But, there'd been something like this going on for quite some time. Every medieval castle had a great hall, often with a minstrel's gallery, and the minstrels would play during the evening. And aristocrats and rulers would have music salon. And in the Esterházy Palace, Esterházy being one of the great Austrian-Hungarian families, with several castles and palaces. And this is in the midway point between Vienna and Budapest, right inside the Austrian border. And they made it a ballroom. The chairs there were no chairs in the original. People danced on this flat floor, but they discovered that the acoustics were exceptional. And being very musical, they hired Joseph Haydn, one of the great classical composers, to be their music master, teaching the family music, composing operas, symphonies, sonatas, all kinds of music, and conducting it. He was like a all-around guy. And so within this elaborately ornamented room, Haydn did for 30 years some of his best work. What's interesting is that it's essentially a shoebox. Rectilinear, the proportions are related to the golden mean, and because of that, it works acoustically. As I say, it was largely by chance that people discovered that was the best form. But having discovered it, of course, they wanted to continue. Why not? If it works, use it again. Here, the seats can be cleared away for a special event, a marriage, something like that. But generally they're in place, and there are about 500 movable chairs and a stage at one end. 2 centuries later, you have the same form used in the Musikverein in Vienna. And this was commissioned by a society of music lovers. And they had a shoebox, which, like the Haydn Saal, has windows in back. And at night, at sunset, the sun streams through this, illuminating the gold gilding of the balcony, the organ, which is behind the piano, the ceiling, and it's and these herms who are supposed to be supporting the balcony. And if you're sitting up here in the balcony at back, it's just an incredible shimmering spectacle. But it's also regarded as probably the best acoustic hall in the world, that and the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, because they generally perform a certain kind of music, mostly 19th century romantic music, but for that it is regarded as perfect balance from every seat in the hall. Complete contrast, another hall commissioned by a society of music lovers, but this is in Barcelona. This is the Palau de Música, recently restored, and it has 2,000 seats. It's radically different, as you can see. It's more the horseshoe of an opera house, but it's for mostly Catalan music, because Catalonia, as you know, was always trying to be independent of the rulers in Madrid, right down to the present, and they wanted, particularly in the late 19th century, to celebrate the artistry and culture of Catalonia. So they commissioned one of the top architects of the time to design this hall. All of the artisans came in to decorate it. And the music that was played there was Catalan music, both popular and more serious. And interestingly, there were artisans, working class people who participated in this. So it was very much a cultural, classless thing. Again, open seating for the most part, a few boxes in front, but really very open and very much a popular attraction. And of course, it was inspired by nationalism, and in a way, another radical hall, the Philharmonie in Berlin, that Hans Scharoun designed, had a similar impulse. Because if you remember, Berlin was divided in two. The Russians took their sector, walled it off in 1961, and the original opera house and concert hall were in that eastern zone. So they were inaccessible to people living in the rest of the city. So in response, the West German authorities and West Berlin authorities commissioned Scharoun to do the hall for the Berlin Philharmonic, a library, and Mies van der Rohe to do the Museum of 20th Century Art in what was called the Cultural Forum. And this was a direct response to the cultural propaganda of the Eastern Zone. And Scharoun, who was probably the most inventive of 20th century or late 20th century German architects, came up with the idea of not a horseshoe, not a shoebox, but essentially what he called a vineyard. If you imagine plots of vines on a hillside looking down into the valley, that is the feeling you get when you go into this hall. And whether you're sitting right at the top in back or down in front next to the stage, you feel very close to the orchestra. You feel that they're playing for you, and they're speaking to you, and the music and architecture are in dialogue. And the same idea inspired the new German opera house. And the idea there was to banish historic ornament and, of course, the pomposity of the Nazi regime, which was only 10, 20 years before. Modernism would be the signifier of democracy, as it had been in the Weimar Republic, because in Berlin at that time, West Berlin was entirely surrounded by East Germany, and several times the Russians threatened to just invade and take it over. So it became a kind of outpost, kind of island of Western values in the middle of the Soviet zone. The plan of this auditorium is essentially a hexagon, and the seating surrounds the stage. There are people sitting behind the stage. Part of it is used if there's a choir. These bleachers here, the choir sit on, and then the orchestra in the foreground. And that served as a model for other halls that wanted to eliminate the barrier between audience and players and bring everyone closer. And then the acousticians had to deal with all of these new geometries and rise to the challenge of creating a hall in which the quality of sound was equally well distributed, so everybody could hear clearly, and that the balance between the instruments and the orchestra would be good, and that the individual players could hear each other, which isn't at all the case in some halls. It's very important, the orchestra know what everybody else is doing on stage. A simplified version of that vineyard plan was used quite recently in Dresden. Dresden had a palace of culture that the East German government had built back in, I think, the 60s. And it was a huge hall that was designed for everything. You could have elephants on stage, you could have party bureaucrats lined up, you could have orchestras, whatever. And it didn't work. It didn't really serve any of those purposes well. So they kept the exterior, but tore out the interior to create this new auditorium. And as you can see, it's fragmented. And the whole idea of these diamond-shaped sound baffles suspended from the ceiling and the white balustrades around the different sections is to provide multiple surfaces for the sound, as indeed you got in the older generation of theatres. In Rome, Renzo Piano, who did the hall in Athens, was asked to do a new concert hall complex in which there would be a large, a small, and a middling-sized theatre. And he exploded that. Instead of doing them all in one building, he expressed each of the halls separately, and two of the three, and they're linked by a arc, almost like an amphitheatre, of open seating. So this plaza in front can be used as a stage for outdoor events, theater, rock concerts, you name it. And then the exterior of the halls are clad in lead panels, which is what the Romans used on their buildings. And so it has a reference to the historic buildings of Rome, even though it's built in a suburb a few kilometers north of the center. And Zaha Hadid did Maxi, very close, so it's become a kind of cultural hub. And it's also near the Olympic Stadium and the buildings that were done for the 1960 Olympics. And inside, you can see he's, again, used the idea of these floating panels, but in a very different way. And indeed, what you'll see, I hope, in these examples is how many variations you can play on a simple theme. The concept is fairly uniform and consistent. The expression allows a lot of freedom to the architect within all the constraints of dimensions. The hall must not be too wide or the sound just disappears. The height of the ceiling above the orchestra is critical. There's an ideal distance. And of course, all the other things that have to be incorporated, like speakers, lights, and so on. So it's a tremendous challenge. He's used the vineyard plan again, with a lot of seating behind the orchestra. And these trays curved at the ends, there are 48 of them, I think, and they create a wonderful warm feeling. You almost feel you're being hugged. Jean Nouvel, as we know, is not huggable. He has many qualities, but that isn't one of them. What he does do, I think, better than a lot of architects, is create a sense of theatricality. And you see that when it's well done, it's marvelous. When it's the Philharmonie, maybe not. And at Lucerne, which is the lakeside resort in Switzerland, he wanted to build it into the lake. Actually, the building, like the Oslo Opera House, that it would extend into the lake. And the local authorities said, no, we're Swiss, we like our lake promenade, and we don't want you building on it. So instead, he roofed the building with a canopy that extends on like 90 meters. I hope I've got that right, over the terrace and out to the edge of the water. And that in turn frames the spectacle of the mountains on the far side of the lake and the ships in the foreground, and of course protects the audience from rain and sun. And it includes a conference center and an art museum, and each one is lined up side by side with canals coming in from the lake, rather as Piano brought water from the sea into the complex in Athens. So here the canals come in and they divide the three major spaces, and you go on a little bridge from one to another, like going over the Venetian canals. And the building is full of cafes, restaurants, multi-level. He's wrapped the back of the auditorium, again, like Oslo, with a very smooth wood surface, which suggests the rear of a boat, the bow of a boat. And within, it's a fairly conventional, rather pared down layout with very shallow balconies. And again, it goes all the way around. And I didn't mention, but of course it's obvious that not only does that create a feeling that the orchestra is the center of the action, but people can look across and see faces rather than the backs of heads. In a conventional theater, you're always looking at the back of somebody's head. Here, you're looking at faces and you feel part of a community. Henning Larsen's concert hall I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, there's a few more, in Reykjavik, in Iceland. Again, a very Nordic climate with a lot of rain and very cold weather for much of the year. And he wanted, like Oslo, to open up the city to the waterfront. Generally, cities were built on a river or port where ships would come in, and that meant the coastline was cut off. It was used for cranes and unloading ships. As all this activity has moved away to deeper water or to other ports, it's opened up the possibility in almost every major city, waterfront city in Europe, to have a new, livable, walkable, inviting waterfront. And for that you need a magnet. The Bilbao Guggenheim was a perfect example of that. Having built that, other people came. Same with Oslo. Here, the Reykjavik decided they would build this whole complex on the water, and then came the financial crash of 2008, and everybody was broke, all the banks were out of business, and there was no funds for building, but happily they had started building the concert hall, and so they were too far along to abandon it, so they finished it, and it became a very popular gathering place. And it's conceived as a kind of sparkling crystal, which you can imagine on a cold winter night as a wonderful thing to walk toward from the subway or bus stop, that drops you off. And the artist, the Icelandic Danish artist, Elias, designed a functional wall of crystals that were actually frames, quite deep, with embedded LED, which cast light through the glass, which turns the glass into a prism, so the light coming into the lobby by day gets not only shadow patterns but also sparkles with different colors, and at night the LED changes colors, so the building is constantly changing its appearance, and so it becomes a very dynamic, a very alive thing. Most ambitious of these civic-minded icons is this is the hall inside the Harper Concert Hall in Reykjavik, and again, warm colors, very appropriate, a feeling of constantly shifting spaces, although in fact the layout is quite traditional within a very untraditional framework. This I'm sure you're familiar with, the Elbphilharmonie in Hamburg, which was designed by Herzog de Meuron about 15 years ago, atop a warehouse. Now the warehouse had been built in the 1940s, just as the port was vanishing, because the container ships couldn't come up the river this far, so the port moved downstream, and that freed up the waterfront for a very ambitious development program, of which this is the magnet. This is the Bilbao Guggenheim, and it consists of hotel rooms, apartments, two small concert halls wrapped around the main concert hall. Somebody described the Royal Festival Hall in London as an egg cushioned within a box. Well, the same description applies to this. It is cushioned not only from light and sound, but also from the rumblings of a subway train passing by, ships coming down the river, because there is still a lot of activity on the river, and it's protected in every way. And within, you go up a long escalator which runs through the warehouse, flattens out, and then takes you into a series of lobbies, viewing gallery, you can see in rear, which looks out over all of the city, and then you continue on up, probably 5 levels, to this extraordinary hall, which to me is the epitome of a modern concert hall, because it not only wraps around, but everywhere you look there's a beautiful pattern with surfaces that are ribbed or inflected in different ways, again to create an even distribution. In Poland, Barocci Vega wanted a building that would echo the Hanseatic port quality of the old port, which was originally German but now Polish because of the shift of borders in the earlier time. And so he created this backlit complex of very spiky roofs and an all-white lobby leading up to a concert hall that, again, all of the interior is abstracted. You'll see the very narrow balconies, a bit like those in Lucerne. This is by Fernando Menes, an architect based in Tenerife, who takes his cues from the volcanic landscape of Tenerife. Like Iceland, Tenerife is full of volcanoes, and the lava has congealed, and Menes takes that idea and abstracts it and creates these very brutalist forms, but introduces brick as almost like mosaic, something mixed in with the concrete that creates a warmth, and in the case of the concert hall, a kind of magical cave. This is probably the most extreme example of how you can model a concert hall in such a way as to create a work of art, but also a wonderful acoustic. Here in Paris, the Scène Musicale, which I'm sure if you haven't been to, you've probably seen, on the Ile Ségouin, which is where Renault built their cars. Shigeru Ban, best known for his emergency shelters, created a concrete block, and at the end, a concert hall contained within this flattened glass sphere, and a baffle that moves around with the sun and contains photovoltaic panels, so that once the sunshade and the generator of energy. And he uses his trademark material, which are cardboard tubes. You know, everything comes rolled on a cardboard tube, and the tubes are thrown away. And for the longest time, he's been using them for support structure, and also decoratively. So the seats are made of cardboard rolls, and the ceiling is a canopy of thin slices from these cardboard rolls. And then in a little village in Bleibach is a unique concert hall done by Peter Heimel, an architect in Munich, for Thomas Bauer, who is a baritone who grew up in this region of Bavaria, and then after he'd established his reputation, decided to buy a farmhouse in the village so that his children would enjoy the same kind of world of nature that he had. And he created this, there was very little money, created a concrete box, tilted down a slope, and lined it with concrete panels. And it feels rather austere and forbidding, but having attended a concert and sat on one of these wire chairs, I have to say it's a fantastic experience. You really feel that you are in a cabinet with the musicians. Two last examples, and that is the end. This is a Pierre Boulez salle designed by Frank Gehry in Berlin for the Barenboim Said Academy, which is a institution designed to bring Arab, Muslim and Israeli students together and actually try to create a dialogue musically and socially. They're in residence in this institution, and this is their concert hall. And Gehry has created a theater in the round where all the chairs can be moved around, reconfigured, very easily, and a gallery that's almost like a wave that goes around slightly off axis from the oval of the ground floor. All of this in what was a scenery storage facility next to the Opera House in Berlin. And the opportunity to be that close, in fact, to be on stage. The audience is, in effect, on stage. There's no difference of height. And, of course, it intensifies the experience. And you can imagine how thrilling it is. I was lucky enough to be there for a rehearsal when a singer is on stage, particularly when it's a spotlit group and everybody else is in darkness. And this final example is the Isar Philharmonie in Munich, where their big hall, the one that they've been using for several decades, turned out to be a complete dud. The sound was so bad that when Bernstein went to conduct, and they said, what should we do to improve it? And he said, burn it down. And instead of burning it down, they went through an incredibly long and expensive process of restoration. In the meantime, the two orchestras who played there needed a concert hall. So they moved to a disused turbine plant, electrical turbine, a power station rather, and the turbine hall, where huge, turbines was cleared, and it became a shared lobby for a university, a library, and the concert hall, which is then built next to it out of prefabricated elements and is a completely anonymous black box. And I said, well, isn't that a little depressing, being an all black, morning hall? And they said, no. When you are there for a concert, it's a bit like the image I just showed of the Pierre Boulez salle, where the figures on stage glow and draw your eye, and so your eyes are drawn to the orchestra on stage, and everything else kind of fades into the background. And thus we fade into the background. Anybody has any questions, comments, or whatever? I'm curious to know how, because I've been spending a year and a half researching this subject, and I've been to many of these halls, and so they all have very special memories for me, but also I'm intrigued by the variety within the, constraints. How did that come across for you? I mean, did you feel, not having been to all these halls, that indeed each one had a personality of its own, or did they all look alike? Come on, somebody speak up.
The first one is a difficult one. After that, you may.
Let's speak loudly, because I'm old and deaf. Come on, somebody, please, don't be shy. Say it. Did you? Right, you.
No, I did. I did feel like each one of them was very different, and I haven't been to that many concert halls, but I really like the way you talk about each one of them, like greatly about all of them. You don't say anything, even if I assume they have some flaws. They all seem very magical.
Did it inspire you to go and maybe see one or two of these?
Yes, I've been to a few that are similar to the tree branch. You said the branches, and I think those are my favorite. But I would like to see more.
I mean, here you've got a great choice. You have the Philharmonie, which at least inside, I think, the Pierre Boulez salle, I think, is wonderful. I don't particularly like the rest of it. The Garnier, obviously, the Opéra Comique, the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, the La Scène Musicale. I'm deliberately omitting the Bastille Opera, which I think is a horror show. But
the acoustic is good.
What?
The acoustic is good.
Any other comments,
Have you been
thoughts?
Because we want to go to a concert hall or an opera during the week. Did you? Since one of you did. No one. Oh, students are good. Absolutely. And Nicolas sent you some examples of. No? No?
More to the point, does it make you at all interested in taking on a project like this as a studio project? I mean, there aren't many concert halls being built, even fewer opera houses, except in China, of course, where everything is, bubbling. But and every city needs an opera house. They don't need an opera house. They think they need an opera house. Once they build it, they very often don't know what to put into it. But there is, and elsewhere, is it something that interests you as a project, not just to look at, but to actually work on? Yes.
Yes. I have a sort of like mixed feeling when it comes to.
Sorry, you'll have to speak a little louder because I'm deaf.
The reflection that I had during this action I asked to take place is that how do you define what like sublime is.
Okay, sublime has many meanings in English. One of them is to awe, to instill a sense of awe. When you're with a person you're in love with, when you are in an incredibly beautiful landscape at sunset, when you are on a mountaintop looking out over, a huge area, there's something about that that's very exciting, excites your emotions, intensifies your feeling for the matter. You get it when a great singer is singing a high aria and the voice cuts through everything. You get it when a pianist is playing with incredible virtuosity and other experiences like that. When that musical experience that you hear is intensified by the beauty or the originality, the creative character of the hall, as it is, I think, in many of these, that instills a sense of awe, and that, I think, is a sublime experience.
Yeah, because I haven't been to many people's like concerts, and from just the pictures, I feel like some of the layout just rely on I was saying, the feeling of immense, of just like large spaces to create a sort of like sublime feeling. But I would say, like, for me, the only one where I was like, wow, well, like, for example, the one in Catalonia, because it's just like the use of like different materials. It's just wow. And the glass, the crystal glass.
Energetic.
Yeah. Because like when the lights just go through and this in the entire just create this sort of like timeless space. And one that I hated, for example, I can't recall the name, but it's like the one with the blue, the sort of like blue.
Yeah, the blue and white Alto Theatre in Essen, yes.
Like, personally, I was like, this is...
Of course. Because Alto was a wonderful architect, and he created a very tactile, very kind of sensuous architecture. It was very much, appealing to the senses. I didn't mention, but I think is crucially important here, the ideal concert hall or opera house makes the experience of the players, of the singers, the musicians, showcases their work to best advantage, and that everybody can hear them perfectly, see them clearly. But it also brings people together. It's a gathering place. It's very much a social activity. Now, at the beginning, in the 18th century and even in the 19th, it was society, the rich, the rich and the well-connected. Now it is for everybody. You go to the Garnier, and you can get a seat for, I think, 10 euros. If there's an empty seat, something that hasn't been bought, well, how much? It's gone up. Well, but still, it's a moderate price, and a lot less you pay for a pop concert. And I don't think they give away any tickets for Taylor Swift. So it isn't inaccessible. And often you can stand, if you are young and have the energy, in a high gallery. And again, you're gathered together with fellow enthusiasts. I went to an opera yesterday afternoon at the Garnier, and the audience was dead quiet for the entire, with occasional applause for an aria. At the end, they exploded. I mean, the cheering and applause went on for 10 minutes. And that kind of shared experience, that kind of feeling of you're together with other people who love what you love or making the same discovery that you are, is, I think, a very exciting thing. And again, sublime, I think, is a good word for it. Yes?
I have a question in response to what you just said. I think the fact that it starts being more accessible is very new, and especially during the days where those operas were built, it was probably absolutely not like that, and it was very elite. Do you think you can see that in the architecture, that it was a very elite thing to do to go to those operas? And if yes, you would relate.
Well, people, I think, go to the opera for so many different reasons. They always have, and I think particularly now, it ceased to be a social spectacle, and has in a sense become, as it was at the very beginning in Venice in the first century of opera, a popular entertainment. Unfortunately, it's an incredibly expensive art to present. There are major companies, I don't know what it's like here in France, but a major company in Munich said they employ 1,000 people full-time and another 1,000 people who, serve as extras or consultants or, people who work part-time. That's an enormous budget, plus the expense of making the sets, the costumes, hiring the talent, bringing in orchestras and singers. That pushes the prices sky high. In Germany, they have a very lavish, have had in the past, it may be changing, support system. I believe the same is true in France. That means that an enlightened company can offer bargain tickets to students. They can, as happened at an opera house in I think it was Belgium, do a dress rehearsal in which the tickets are free for certain categories of people, low income, handicapped, whatever. And so the idea is to enlarge the audience, to bring them in. Now, the people who come may come because of the stage spectacle, the favorite singer, the tunes, they like to go home whistling the tunes. When Mozart premiered Don Giovanni in Prague in 1787, he wrote home, everybody in Prague is singing Figaro. They're all whistling Figaro. And it was a kind of popular thing. It was like, a major musical today. And that kind of segmented interest. Some people, of course, go for the whole thing, but a lot of people are really only interested in one thing because one singer is there. They would pay a fortune just for that one singer, as they would for a pop star. But it is a total work of art, and it does offer, I think, an experience for eyes and ears and the emotions. So, you can't limit it.
I think my question is more on an architectural level, because I feel like, to me, those halls and also the way the halls are sort of encapsulated behind different layers has something elite already in the way it is built. But I would be interested in knowing what you think about it.
Can you explain more what you mean?
I mean, it was often something about seeing and being seen, right? Also, you talked about families buying their own...
that was 150 years ago.
So,
or 100 years ago, anyway.
I mean, the way to develop, but to a certain extent, the core of how operas are built, with the stage in the middle, and then the hall, and then there's different layers, how you enter towards the hall.
But come on, elite is a loaded word, and it's, I think, much overused. When a spectacle is accessible to everybody, at a price they can afford, and where there is good explanation, good interpretation of the work, as there usually is, whether it be a program brochure or a lecture before the performance, I don't even call it elitist. It was elitist, no question, in its original, for much of its history, but not now. And the layering that you speak of provides a choice of vantage points. It's true, if you're in the upper gallery, you're seeing the tops of people's heads and their tiny little specks in the distance. You aren't getting the best view, but you may get the best sound. Because interestingly, when you're in the back row, and I've been in the back row and upstairs very often, the sound somehow all comes together there, even better than if you're sitting in the orchestra. So it's not just, downstairs good, upstairs bad. Secondly, the idea of layering gives a structure to the hall. It isn't all one row of seats. Wagner did one bank of seats. And because it's a religious experience, or for the people who love Wagner, it's a religious experience, nobody complains. But actually, it's a terrible hall. The orchestra is buried underneath the stage. There's no air conditioning because that might disturb the sound. So the orchestra is working at 40 degrees in tank tops, sweating, because there is no air conditioning and no ventilation, and the patrons who have dressed up for the occasion are wearing, dinner jackets and whatever, sitting in this chair as hard as this. It's suffering. You suffer for your art. So when you have a theater with full of very comfortable seats, in upstairs, downstairs, to either side, even behind the orchestra, you're given a choice. I don't think that's elitist. I think that's actually very accommodating. Yes?
You mentioned there was one opera house. There was one opera house where the seats were uncomfortable and super tight.
Only one?
Multiple, actually. So is this a notion of respect for the art? Why is this chosen over comfort?
Sorry, you're talking about Wagner's opera house and my comment that the seats were uncomfortable. Right, well, generally, people like to be comfortable, and the architects and management want them to be comfortable and come back. With the Festspiel House, as I said, it's like a church or a shrine. It's a captive audience. These are true believers. They would go on their knees in order to hear Wagner played in this place. It's not that they don't care about comfort, but they're willing to be uncomfortable for the experience. And they originally were allowed to bring in cushions. Not anymore, because it was decided that cushions would absorb too much of the sound, and as indeed would plush seats. That's why they're thin. It's not thin just to make people suffer. It's thin in order not to be a sponge absorbing sound and deadening it. Now, yesterday afternoon in the Garnier, I had a good seat, but the sound wasn't the best. Even at that distance from the stage, I didn't know what it was like upstairs. It sounded a little quiet and muffled because it's a huge space and it is so richly decorated and the seats are so well padded that a lot of the sound vanishes. Whereas the France Radio auditorium, which I urge you to go to because it's not only one of those beautiful auditoriums I've seen, but also incredibly good sound. You can hear such intensity. Any more? Or?
It's true that it's not going to the opera house or to a concert hall. It's not at all the same as going to a show or Taylor Swift. Definitely not. Because the sound is not amplified. So you hear the real sound of everyone playing or singing. So this is totally different. So you really have to experience that. Because this is really particular. And when you are surrounded by this sound, it's really, as you said, an emotion. So please, go once, at least, to understand what we are talking to. It's a real pleasure. We are talking about pleasure since 2 weeks now. This is a real pleasure, a strong pleasure.
Yes.
Just a question. When you showed the Esterhazy theater in the beginning, the Esterhazy theater, then you showed another one, rectangular,
right,
bigger. I don't remember which one
it was. Well, the first one was the Cuivier's Theatre, which is a court theatre of 500 in Munich. The second, looking toward the stage, was the San Carlo Theatre, which is about 2,000 seats in Naples.
Okay, so the question is, there's in Paris a very small theatre called La Salle Cortot, which is it's small, it's rectangular too, but transversal,
Mhm.
and it has fantastic acoustics. So you were saying that these two theaters had beautiful acoustics. San Carlo, I think you said, had an incredible acoustics. So the question is, maybe a silly question, but why did no one do again rectangular theaters like this? Because they had such good acoustics. Of course, it was for the aristocrats downstairs.
Well, the concert hall, you can sit behind or to the side of a orchestra and still get good sound and good view. If you're sitting behind the orchestra, you're watching the conductor, which is kind of exciting. You're seeing what the orchestra is seeing. You couldn't do that with opera. Opera is a face-on spectacle. Because of that, and because part of it is the history of the development. You know, the Teatro Farnese in Parma started out to be a kind of imitation of antiquity, or what people imagined antiquity was like. It was taking the hemisphere of the amphitheater and taking it indoors, and often the space enclosed by the ellipse of seats wasn't used for seats, but for spectacle. Again, bringing the actors or singers or whatever forward, and again, creating a kind of theater in the round. Mm-hmm. And I think all through the history of theaters, we haven't talked obviously about dramatic theaters, but there's been this constant to and fro between theater in the round, which allows everybody to feel they've got the orchestra or the players in their grasp, but presents difficulties for the actors who can only face in one direction at once. So if an actor isn't spinning around, he's got his back to part of the audience.
Yeah, cool. And Lugano seems rather rectangular. Right?
Yeah, Lugano is, Lucerne, it's as I say, it goes back and forwards. You know, even an architect as radical, fairly radical anyway, as Jean Nouvel, who loves theater, who loves, dramatic contrast, right? Sometimes, I wouldn't say retreats, but adopts a more conventional format, particularly if it's one that's been proved to work. It doesn't have to be a theater in the round or a vineyard plan, but there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's very much a choice an architect makes, and the best theaters are those in which the architect, the musicians, and the acousticians are working as a team. Then the architect will say, right, I want a wedge, I want, blocks of seating here, and the acoustician said, yes, but if you do that, the sound won't be well balanced, so why don't you pull it in a little? There's a theatre in London, the Royal Festival Hall, which was a big showpiece after the war, and it was too wide. And because it's too wide, they can't do anything with it. The acoustics will never be really good there because there's too much space. And the sound gets swallowed up. Royal Albert Hall, same thing.
You said Hamburg has always fantastic acoustics. You said about Hamburg. Yeah.
Hamburg, yes.
You said because,
Hamburg was developed with one of the top acousticians and one of the best architects, and I think that somehow or other they got it right.
I remember Herzog saying we cannot.
The Japanese acoustician.
The Hamburg Elbphilharmonie.
No, but the acoustician was the Japanese one. No, who was the acoustician?
Herzog de Meuron.
No, the acoustician.
Oh, the acoustician was Toyota of Nagata Acoustics.
Okay, so
He did 8 of the theatres that I'm writing about, and he is, for me, the master.
Few acousticians who are very good in the world for doing that.
I remember Herzog saying, we cannot do better than Scharoun.
Right, I mean, there are 2 ways of approaching this. One is to say, okay, this example works, let's do exactly the same thing. When Disney Hall was being discussed in Los Angeles, the leader of the orchestra went to Frank Gehry and said, look, we've played in the Boston Symphony Hall. which was built in 1900, and we love it. So why don't you just replicate the the Boston Hall, and we'll be entirely happy. And Frank said, you have a hobby, I think. You make copies of Stradivarius violins in your spare time. Would you think that your copies are as good as the original? Of course, the answer was no. But certain ideas, they say, recur. I think this is true of all architecture, that it's a constant looking forward, looking back, trying to find a different combination of elements. We're all about the same size and have the same characteristics that we did, 500 years ago. We may dress differently, we may have different attitudes, but the fact is the physical body is the same. So a hall that was designed, 400 years ago can in fact work very well for the present.
I'm just in.
Yeah.
It's just okay. I've never been to opera before, but I've listened to a lot of live music in certain places like bars or like I remember when I was in Lisbon, I heard like a Faro band in a bar. It was like a concert there, and there was the glasses sounds. And the people speaking sometimes, but shutting out when the music was here. And my question is, does it take some of the sublime, the atmosphere of the place around the music? Do we need for the music only the music, or does it? That's the question.
Huh.
No, I didn't write it.
Yeah, well, as I said before, everybody has a very different experience, I think, in these halls. And you can be unlucky. You can be sitting next to somebody who is constantly looking at their cell phone all through the performance. You can, or making noises or whatever, chattering. And it's rare to have a perfect experience where everything is in sync, where the music, the singing, the audience response, the comfort level, the sound, the sight, too many variants. But occasionally it all comes out right. You can be lucky or unlucky, and if you go often enough, you're probably going to have enough good experiences. Yeah.
Coming back on the acoustic.
Yeah. Which, by the way, I'm having a problem with here. This room is not, I would say, a good acoustic space. Do something about it.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the material has like any influence.
The materials.
Yeah, because I was hearing like.
Yeah, a very good point. It's crucially important. Toyota, the acoustician that Dio just mentioned, was called in to do a remedial job on the Bamberg Symphony Hall, which had been built as late as the 1990s. It was only 20 years old. And apparently a famous musician from Munich had come and was asked what he thought of the acoustics. And he went, fantastic. And he was so revered that nobody questioned this. So they went ahead, opened the hall, and it wasn't good. It wasn't as good as it should have been. So 20 years later, they bring Toyota in, and he said, for starters, take the varnish off the wood. That is, blocking sound. I didn't know all the technicalities, but they were all kinds of little details. It was almost like tuning an instrument. And by changing materials, for example, in concert halls now, white cedar is the preferred wood for the stage. Why? Because it has the right degree of resonance. Then if you have an empty chamber underneath the stage, that creates a kind of resonance too. It's a bit like a drum. drum, you hit the surface of the drum, but there's space inside, and that's what creates the drum sound. If you were banging on the table, it would sound very different. And in all these different ways, he was, moving partitions around. Sometimes a sound baffle that, the sound comes up from the orchestra and is directed out, and that can be tilted. You can tune the acoustics by having fabric panels. You can open, almost like opening a closet door, in order the sound comes in and is either absorbed or reflected. All of these different things, and the wood that is used, the finish on the wood, what is behind the wood. When they rebuilt the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York, they poured concrete under the stage, and suddenly the sound went completely dead, because the concrete was too much. But if you have a rear wall covered with wood, you want a concrete surface behind in order to punch the sound back. Now, I'm not a acoustician or a technician, but so I only understand a little part of this. But what is clear is the materials, the depth of the materials, what lies behind the materials, what degree of ornament or fragmentation, where the baffles are, how high the ceiling is above the orchestra. All of those factors change the sound. So if you are designing a concert hall, you have a real challenge, and get those acousticians on your side.
Maybe I'm continuing the same question. And the geometry, like the parallel walls or oblique walls, ceilings, just a matter of the geometrical form.
Right.
That has probably some importance.
It's more than geometry. It's proportion, the proportion of width to length to height, and the volume to the number of seats. As I said, it used to be that all of the classic concert halls were rectilinear. But when Scharoun really broke that mold, Scharoun was really the person who more than anybody else said, no, it doesn't have to be like that, and proved right. The ideal, Berlin is not ideal. There are seats where you cannot hear so well. So there is a price to be paid for breaking the rules, but he got away with it for, let's say, 95%.
And there is still a debate between architects, especially in Germany, about this Scharoun concept hall instead of having the box. And I remember having a discussion in Düsseldorf with an architect who was specialized in a concert hall, and he said, oh, do the shoebox, whatever it is. I said, no, look at Scharoun. He said, oh, it's ugly. It doesn't work. I said, yes, it works. So this is really particular. There is really debate and ideology about that.
There was a very funny story in Paris about Salle Pleyel. Salle Pleyel used to be a concert hall, and the walls were like that, and the acoustics was terrible. And the thing is, people would say that when you went there, you could hear the concert 2 times. And then someone else said, it's okay, you have for your money, you can hear the concert.
Right. Well, it's interesting because a dome can create that echo effect. In fact, you've probably been to places where the guide whispers something from the other side and you can hear it perfectly on the other side. A circular hall has problems. I went to a concert in London at the Albert Hall, which has 5,000 seats. And every year, the BBC, the Broadcasting Association, do a series of what they call promenade concerts. And they call it that because the arena is where students can stand for very little money and be quite close to the orchestra and get very good sound, but they have to stand. The people in the galleries, it was like sound coming from a distant planet. And they have been tinkering with this for 150 years. Every generation hopes to be able to make the concert halls sound better, and maybe incrementally they do, but it's still defective. And when it was inaugurated, the inaugural speech was heard twice. everything that was said came back as a faithful echo. Yes.
Do you have a favorite memory of a concert you've been? Do you have a favorite?
Sorry, you'll have to speak up.
Do you have a favorite memory or place? Do you want to share it with us?
Memories. You know, I'm not a musician, and I haven't been to nearly as many opera houses or concert halls in the past as I should have, because I love music, but I just didn't make the effort. So writing this book was an education, or researching this book rather, was an education. Finding extraordinary experiences in completely unexpected places, like Bleibach, the one with the concrete walls and wire seating. You'd think, what a horror show. I mean, like a torture chamber. No, the Bern Camerata came with a violinist who must have gypsy blood, because she dances around like this and is practically dancing as she's playing. I forget her name, it's an impossible name to pronounce. And she energized this group, and they were playing a kind of anthology of pieces from their repertoire, in which each piece would, as it were, flow into the other for about 25 minutes, and then there'd be an intermission and then another one. And she was dancing among them, kind of, as it were, encouraging them to loosen up and become more expressive, which she did. And it was magic. I mean, pure magic. You couldn't imagine a more transporting experience than that. Moments where an aria is sung with such piercing intensity, like the end of Faust in a production I saw a few days ago, and in the Ardente in the Garnier, when the voices do come across, when they are not muffled or obscured, then it's, I think, thrilling. But as I said before, it's very much a personal taste.
I remember having been in the Verona Arena, watching or listening to the Tosca. Yeah. And everybody was singing. They were all singing the partition from beginning to the top, to the end. It was incredible atmosphere. But I didn't hear the musician. I just heard people singing.
But sometimes it's a disaster. I mean, I've walked out of an intermission from
disaster. It was a collective
from things. I mean, Benjamin Britten's Midsummer Night's Dream. You think of Mendelssohn, Shakespeare, very delicate fantasy, set in a car wrecking yard with everybody in punk costume flying around on trapezes. Well, the music, forget the music. I mean, it was a complete disaster. Or a magic flute where, you have a few characters, and instead there were about 100 people on stage doing nothing, just standing around. I assume they were being paid and they had some value, but literally a complete misunderstanding of what the whole story was about. On the other hand, one of the very best productions of The Marriage of Figaro, Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, I saw on my computer on YouTube by students of the Royal College of Music in London. Modern dress, they were all, of course, very young. Modern dress, very, very simple, so expressive. The acting, the characterizations, the feeling of tension, the war of the, master and servant, the, way the women are treated. It came across so strongly.
Because, for example, in the opera in Paris and Bastille, sometimes some years ago they were experimenting to ask artists to do the setting. And I remember having seen some show of opera, but the artist was taking the first role instead of serving the opera. It was a disaster. So you don't. You never know.
Okay, have you had enough of me?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you for making this work impeccably.